please let me introduce on the stage Mr. Daniel Sachs, the founder of the Daniel Sachs Foundation. Please welcome him on the stage. So, Daniel, first of all, thank you for coming all the way from Sweden.
Thank you.
I understand you already met some people yesterday at the dinner.
Yes, very nice.
So, some of you are already familiar. I'm very glad you made it here, and I understand that you can help us a little bit with this question, how the philanthropists and the people from business can support democracy. What is your experience, your personal experience? But first of all, maybe the first question is, how did you, start with this whole thing, supporting democracy and being a philanthropist? What is your story?
So very nice to be here, first of all. I think, as always, there's a bit of serendipity involved in how we engage in different things. I think for me, there were a couple of things in my childhood. I grew up with two parents who were academics. My mother is an anthropologist, a professor of anthropology, and my father is an architect. He worked in the architectural work and kind of humanistic dimensions of architecture. So I grew up around the dinner table where there was a lot of discussion about politics, about social justice. And I also had some early experiences of my own of exclusion that were quite formative for me. So I kind of grew up with a very strong sense of the importance of inclusion. And then I felt my parents were a bit abstract in what they did, so I decided to pursue a career in business, because that was kind of more concrete. We heard that from the last panel, dollars and cents. But I also had another experience which I think was important for me. In my late 20s, I was elected to the board of the Stockholm City Mission, so the leading homelessness organization in Sweden. And I suddenly realized that the tools that I have and what I can do as a business person turned out to be useful not only in a kind of in a business environment, but in an environment of social change. So that was also very kind of empowering, and I started then kind of dabbling with engaging in society in different ways. And then when I turned 40, without saying how old I am, that's 15 years ago, roughly. So I turned 40, and then my friends gave me, when it says I'm the founder of the Daniel Sachs Foundation, that's actually not true. Because my friends gave me the foundation for 40th birthday
like
gift.
The most expensive gift.
Yes, it's a crazy expensive gift for me. It wasn't that expensive for them, actually, but that's a different story. But because they thought, I needed to get more organized, and since then I have become more organized and more focused, and Paul Alarcon, who's here as well, who's the Secretary General of the Foundation, we work very closely in these types of issues. But then it was still largely about inclusion, about kind of more, it was more of a civil society focus. But then in 2014, we funded a couple of Get Out the Vote campaigns, so basically mobilizing young voters to the European election in 2014 and then the national election in Sweden in 2014. And that was a kind of an eye-opening moment because it was very clear this kind of huge gap between all the energy and the kind of the social change imperative that was present in social movements and in activism. And then when we would talk to those people and say, so you're going to vote, right? And it was like, no, politics, it's not for us. It was very clear. I mean, the lack of trust was very evident. And that's when we started realizing that actually this issue of, especially I would say young people and young people's trust in politics and institutions, in their agency in a democratic system, that is a really existential piece. And very few people were working on this. Philanthropy was mostly focused on supporting civil society to challenge institutions, but very few were stepping close to the institutional side. So I think that's when we started kind of realizing that this is actually a field that needs more attention. And since then, we've been very focused on that.
And can you get back a little bit to that year when you started supporting this Get Vote initiative? Was there a big discussion among you and people around you? Are we going into politics, or was it just we are going to support just people to vote?
Well, I think, and that kind of comes back to the discussion earlier about political versus apolitical. Everything we do is non-partisan, right? So it's not about promoting an idea that we believe in, or kind of saying that a certain sort of politics is more important than the other. We can talk about kind of the limits of what is partisan and non-partisan if you want later, but so this was not, it was not that we said we need to promote a certain political outcome, but it was that we said this fact that young people are disengaging from our common institutions is a huge societal problem, and we want to change that. So it's not, you know, for us it wasn't really a difficult decision in that regard. I think the other thing that became obvious was that, you know, I think we had some impact. It's hard to measure, but we did this bus tour in Sweden. We met a lot of young people. We had concerts, and, you know, election information and all kinds of things. But what we realized is that if we really want to change how young people relate to democracy and politics, we can't pop up 3 weeks before the election and tell them to vote. I mean, that's a very short-term, superficial, transactional relationship to democracy. And we realized that if we want to change this, we have to put in place much longer-term processes and projects and work on kind of the foundations of democratic participation.
Okay, so what was the next step? I mean, from this one to the one that we are going to make this long-term project.
Yeah. So the next step, we did kind of an after-analysis after these kind of get-out-the-vote campaigns. And for me, there's this kind of vicious circle between low trust from young people in democracy and politics and institutions, leading to low participation. And of course, low participation leads to poor representation, which leads to even lower trust. And you kind of had this ongoing kind of negative development. And then for us, the catalyst in this was representation. So if we can change over time who is in politics, then that should improve trust. Also, we had these surveys, there were these millennial surveys that said that 80% of young people who disengaged from democracy did so because they felt that they weren't represented, or that they felt that there's no one who understands my situation, there's no one like me. So a lot of it was about representation. And then we had this amazing group of young people in the social movement, so we said, okay, let's train some of those people to actually go into politics. And instead of standing outside the tent throwing stones, to come into the tent and sit around the table in the rooms where the decisions are made. So that was kind of our idea. And then we did a lot of research and thinking, and then we launched the Höj rösten, the Raise Your Voice Foundation in Sweden, and the Political Academy. So it's really, today we call them political leadership incubators. So it really is about training people who already have deep political engagement and have kind of very clear ideas of societal change, and then giving them the tools to be successful in politics. And that was the start. And now we're doing this, the Apolitical Foundation that we co-founded based in Berlin, and we're now in almost 70 countries in the world, and this group of academies is growing in a lot of places.
Maybe one small question. How much of a research did you do before decided what to do?
Probably not enough.
Okay.
No, but I think we are quite entrepreneurial in the sense. We have this model, because the traditional philanthropic model of grant making, I think, is problematic in a few ways. I think the notion that people who are brilliant social change makers should spend a lot of time writing applications and then doing follow-ups on those applications and kind of desk work instead of being out there to change society. And then people like me should sit around board tables and read papers and try and judge, is this a brilliant change maker, or is it just someone who's great at writing applications? And so there's a lot of waste in that model. And I think that was, I think it was Václav who talked about it as well, that I think it's also really important to be self-critical when you give and think about what kind of effects do I create, etc. So we developed this model that we call funded activism. And what it is, it's really kind of an entrepreneurship or an incubation model. We identify societal challenges that we think are important, and then we try to devise solutions, and then we do research. But we're not, we're not an academic institution, so we can also move from our gut, but we try and find the facts that inform our intuition, and then we just go. We find the person typically to run it, and then we just go. We do the first year 100% funded by us. So instead of the right people running around raising money, they can run an academy for a year. And then we can iterate and learn from that, and then we can raise money from others. So when you say, did we do enough research? No, we learned much more, I think, when we put the show on the road, so to speak, than kind of the analysis.
So basically, learning on the go.
Yes.
Okay. And back to the people. You mentioned this is very much bipartisan activity.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I wouldn't say bipartisan. I think bipartisan indicates that there are only two parties.
Okay.
But non-partisan, cross-partisan, multi-partisan. Yeah.
The question is, how do you choose, the possible next leaders from this young generation? What are the things you are looking at?
So some of the things we're looking at. First of all, they have to have already very clear ideas of their political commitment. So they have ideas of how they want to change society, and we look for that kind of. Basically, I mean, the kind of overall answer is we look for kind of political potential. Someone who can be very successful in politics, and that I think starts with having a very clear idea of what you want to achieve. It usually starts also with having a clear kind of why and a base, and sometimes a constituency or a community that you feel you represent, and roots in that, etc. And then I think if you go from, not all activists are good politicians, and I think most people realize that, but it's one thing to be good at protest, and some people are brilliant at protest. But it is something completely different to sit around the table with people who you kind of fundamentally disagree with and try and work out solutions and know where your red lines are. And some people are too transactional. That's also a problem. But so that openness and that, I think, focus on actual political impact. It's sometimes you have to compromise to actually achieve change rather than standing by your idea to 100% and not being kind of impactful. In terms of the partisan question, because we get that a lot, I mean, if you take the Swedish program, we don't ask where people stand politically. That's not part of the application process at all. We do, however, represent certain values. So we say that the values that we stand on are, equal opportunity for all, equality, openness, religious freedom, media freedom. There are a number of kind of fundamental constitutional values. But they are actually, even if some of those constitutional values are challenged by parties who are sometimes democratically elected, to me, they will always remain non-partisan, right? So if you challenge the idea of religious freedom, or you challenge the right to asylum, then you're operating outside of kind of an accepted general idea of what our societies are built on, and that we don't condone.
Okay. Here is a question from Slido. How to explain to politicians that supporting political innovation is non-partisan and not against them toward better democracy?
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes hard to explain things to politicians, as we know. But I think we experience this differently. When we launched this school, there was a lot of kind of Swedish politicians in the press saying, well, we don't need your help, thank you, and we can manage ourselves, and so on. But then after a few years, they started actually engaging with us. And I think a lot of politicians have also realized that innovation is deeply necessary, because they also see the numbers where 50 to 70%, we saw the Slovak numbers we heard this morning, of people are not satisfied with democracy. And so I think it's really important for politicians to take that seriously, because this is really an issue that is not a partisan issue, but it's an issue of how politicians engage with the electorate and how you kind of close that space between the elected and the electorate. And of course, the ones that are best at that will also have electoral successes, right?
Okay. But maybe you can also say, from your personal experience, like, do you say who are you voting for, or this sort of things, or you are just trying to be personally not attached to a...
Me?
Yeah.
I never speak about where I stand politically, no. And I've kind of made that choice. But, to be clear, I have no problem with people also supporting individual parties or candidates, or, of course, that's also important. That's also an important way of engaging. But we have dedicated ourselves entirely to kind of non-partisan systems change. And I think that's also the way... I mean, there was talk in the last panel also about... kind of the personal cost of engaging politically for business people, and I think that's a very real thing in some countries more than others. And I think there's also kind of power in numbers, and we're thinking a lot about that. How can we kind of build communities of business people that engage on these types of issues? Because that kind of diffuses some of the personal risk. And that's, of course, much more easy and much more, I think, relevant to do if you're not promoting a certain policy or politic, but you're promoting kind of non-partisan systems change. Okay,
so that's one of the ways how to do it, to create something where you connect a group of people or somebody who is in the middle, who is just
de-risk this kind
de-risk
of
this idea. Okay. Can you name specific politicians that you raise? I mean, the question could be how many people already went through this political academic system?
So when we look at the Swedish program, which is the data I remember, but there are data from all these 66 countries that I can't keep in my head. But there we have about 90% or even over 90% of the people that go through programs join a political party and become politically active from kind of beforehand standing outside. And about 25-30% of them actually become politically active and kind of go into politics for real. And that's roughly kind of the ambition that we've had in the program. But it is a very explicit, it's not a general leadership course, it is very explicitly about training people for politics.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, but I will try to go back to them later.
You have your own questions.
I have some. I mean, those are better, of course, but let's do one of those and then we will go back. No, I mean, I found your statement, we talked too little about how existentially important democracy is for business.
Yeah.
And maybe just, to make sure to all the people here, why we don't talk that much about it, and why is it so important for you?
Yeah. So I think the last panel actually did a brilliant job, all three of you, Andrei and Václav and Zoltán, talking about this, and I think Zoltán having been active in Hungary, and if you've been, then I think you've felt that very clearly. But I think that there's kind of a tension here, because some of these kind of more populist political forces sometimes come to power promoting policies that look very business friendly, right? Deregulation and lower taxes maybe, and it's easy, I think, for business people to sometimes kind of feel at home in that sort of messaging, and the Hungarian example is such an example. If you look at the Hungarian economy, the first couple of years after Orbán's first election, the Hungarian economy did brilliantly, right? And then it's been pretty bad since then. And then, of course, the other dimensions of this sort of politics comes into play with corruption and capture of institutions and kind of less foreign investment. So for me, it's just very clear that there are at least two reasons to engage. One is Andrei talked about self-interest, and that's very much where I am as well. That as business people, our long-term success is entirely dependent on operating in free and democratic societies with predictable institutions, with social cohesion, and kind of general trust in society. So to promote that is very much kind of an investment in self-interest. And then the other reason for me, I think, is that for the ones of us who've been reasonably successful over the last few decades in a place like Sweden or in other kind of European countries, we've been successful largely thanks to operating in democratic and open societies with kind of free trade and with movement of people and all of that. And now that those things are under threat, it's our responsibility to also give back, I think. And you ask why. I mean, some of the stories came out in the panel in terms of personal security and also the notion that you can become kind of an enemy of the state if you speak up against the government, and there are all of those things. But I think also more fundamentally, the relationship between kind of business and power and money and politics historically has been highly problematic, with a lot of narrow self-interest and a lot of lobbying. So a lot of people are kind of feel that this is kind of a dirty space to be. I'm not in politics, and they see it as a different world. What we're doing is we're kind of changing that narrative. So we're saying, we're not saying that you should go into politics to promote your own narrow self-interest, but you should be in politics to be part of a broader movement to change the system in non-partisan ways, because you are dependent on that over the long term. So we're now in the early days of setting up sort of a membership organization of business people globally, hopefully over time, and really to kind of make business more aware of, or more engaged in being kind of trustees of the society that enables their success over the long term. And I think that's how business should think of their relationship to society.
Did you have some sort of moment when you said to yourself, I'm paying too high price for this thing, or never?
No.
No.
What do you mean?
I mean...
I don't even understand the question.
Very good, very good. Then we have some other questions that you answer. Okay. There's a question about young people entering the politics and how to keep them, you know, motivated and not become cynical about the whole issue. Is there a way?
No, I mean, this is a big question because there is this eternal debate. Some people tell us that you train young leaders. How can you train young leaders to come into a system which is corrupt or is not functioning? Or so it's kind of the eternal debate of whether personal change or changing of kind of training people comes first or systems change comes first. I'm deeply convinced that systems only change thanks to people, and that by renewing leadership, we can also kind of instigate systems change. But of course, what we've seen over time is that it's not enough to train a young person and then kind of put them out there to go and run their campaign and hopefully succeed. We have to support them all the way. So we built, I mean, the Apolitical Foundation that we set up and founded a number of years back, which is kind of the hub for all of these academies. We have a number of other programs. We have a program on kind of what we call circular politics, which is kind of also engaging with citizens' assemblies, deliberative decision-making and budgeting, participatory processes, things that kind of close the space between people and the politicians they've elected. But also a big program on politicians and mental health. You know, and this is kind of to this question. I think that 1 out of 6 elected women in the world drop out before the end of their first term because of mental health issues. So this is 1 out of 6.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a huge. I mean, it is tough to go into politics, and especially when you haven't grown up in the youth movement and you come from outside. But I think what we can do is we can build a community across of support of people in other countries that are kind of on the same journey, etc. So we have to support them along the journey.
Okay. And when you choose those people, I mean, there is a question in the context of raising new politicians. Do you agree with those who seek power do not deserve it?
No, I don't. No, I don't. No, I think that there was a conversation about education earlier today. And I think there are a lot of things that people need to learn, but I think one of the most important things that we can teach young people is the sense of agency, and the sense of that I have a stake in the system and in society, and my voice matters, and I can have an impact. So I would love if more people seek power, and I think it's not about if you seek power, it's about why you seek power. Okay. So I would say those who seek power for the wrong reasons do not deserve it, but we're training people who have a very clear why, and they know what societal change they want to achieve, and I think we should embrace the fact that they seek power.
Okay, another one, how to get more of these young people to get to vote. There was a question about it. Yeah. Is there something, you know, there is really the cause where you can really engage the people, the young people, and make them go to the polls and vote and engage into politics?
Well, I think, you know, and this is kind of a general underlying phenomenon. I mean, if we look at the lack of trust in institutions across, and it was interesting also this morning in I don't know the interesting man who made a presentation. I don't know his name, but
Pavel.
And he talked about kind of interhuman trust and kind of the trust in society, what I would call horizontal trust. So horizontal trust is extremely important. But vertical trust, so kind of my trust as an individual in the institutions that represent me, etc. I would argue that the causality is that stronger vertical trust leads to stronger horizontal trust. So if you have greater trust in institutions, in politics, in that there is a common good that you're part of, you will also trust your fellow humans better. So I think what was the question? I forget, but you asked the question that made me talk about this.
No,
you've also forgotten what the question was. we're really bad at this. Right?
No, we were talking about how to engage the young people. Yeah. You know, to go to vote.
Oh, you said why people go to vote. Yeah. So what I would say is that the political developments that we see now, where we see. I mean, you had Romania recently. You have a number of countries in Europe and in other places where people elect, and including young people, elect kind of less democratic political movements and parties and forces. we've spent a lot of time analyzing that and doing polls. And when you look at it, when people actually go from the center to the fringes politically, very, very few do that for ideological reasons. People change to the fringes because they've lost entirely the trust in the establishment to change their daily lives and the established political parties and political leadership, etc. So when we talk about how do we get young people to engage, I actually think it's less about the ideas. I mean, the ideas are mobilizing in themselves. I mean, the Polish election, of course, kind of the ideas won in the sense that there were a lot of young people who mobilized to defend Poland against what they perceived as an anti-democratic government. But I think that if we want to really achieve change in how people, young people relate to politics, it's about institutional change. It is about new leadership, new faces, new voices. It is about new ways of engaging with the electorate. We've written, Paul and I have written pieces and done speeches, etc., on something we call radical centrism. And what we mean by that is we think that a lot of the established parties in the center are doing exactly the wrong thing because they're staying institutionally stale. They're the same leadership, but they're trying to move ideologically to catch these voters. And it turns out when we poll people that people are still in the same place, largely ideologically. This is not an ideological concern. So instead, when we talk about radical centrism, it builds on a number of things. It builds on, again, what I said just now, on radically changing leadership, on the kind of the institutional culture, the party culture. It builds on innovation in terms of how a party, an institution interacts with the people that it serves. Again, deliberative processes, checking in what people actually want over time. It builds on new policies, but it also builds on ideological integrity, of not moving ideologically, because that is not the problem.
Okay, so just bringing the innovation and new ways of doing things. You talk a lot about innovation, actually. So, can you explain to people what do you consider real innovation in the political system?
So I mean, there are different. First of all, there are voting. There's rank voting and quadratic voting and ways of getting kind of depolarized. Because when you actually rank alternatives, etc., that can change how you vote. But I think, for me, I think the whole kind of citizens' assembly movement is in a way more interesting. I can give you an example. So the Irish referendum on abortion, of course, a very kind of touchy subject in Ireland and in a lot of other places. So the Irish government decided to put together a citizens' assembly. So what they did was they selected randomly 100 Irish citizens. They were selected to be demographically representative of the population of Ireland. So people got an email and said, you've been chosen to be part of the citizens' assembly. And then, so people didn't kind of put up their hand, but they were actually sorted and selected. These people were then brought together over a period of a number of months, and their task was to articulate the two alternatives for the referendum. So what are we voting on? What is alternative 1 and what's alternative 2? And their task was to get the alternatives such that the majority for one of them was the largest possible in the group. And that took a number of months and iterations, and it was guided, and in the end they ended up with 75-ish% being pro-abortion, but with certain very clear guardrails, and I think it was 76-24 actually, and 24% being against that first alternative. That vote was then, without the politicians touching those alternatives, it was just put to the Irish public. And two things that are interesting here. One is that the Irish public voted almost exactly as the group. It was 75-25. The second piece is that the people who voted for the 25% found the whole process entirely legitimate. They didn't protest, they felt that we've been represented in this process. That, to me, is an example of true democratic innovation. How you kind of close, because I don't think we should replace representative democracy with doing lots of referendums every time. But this is a way of what we call circular democracy. It's not kind of replacing the politicians, but it's engaging much more closely with kind of taking the temperature of the electorate.
Okay. One more question. What part of your program is about political skills, and what part, if any, is about tools necessary to maintain values and the humility?
So we train, these programs are roughly a year long. They're executive programs, so they meet for 8, 10, 12, 2-3 day kind of sessions over a year, and then they have tasks in between. what we train is, part of it is skills and kind of negotiation technique, debate technique, you know, how to build a political platform. Part of it is a substance, so sustainability transition, economic policy, geopolitics. And then part of it is also the context, the system, you know, how does the system work? What do I need to do in order to be kind of electable and all of that? And then there's another thing which I think is in certain ways more important, which we would call political maturity. And that's less tangible, but it really is about, again, that move from outside the tent to inside the tent. So going from a kind of an intuition of protest and kind of sticking to an exact values position and never compromising with that, etc., to a position of again, compromise and impact and political change.
Okay. One question that is probably very important for many people sitting here: how can business leaders effectively balance their corporate responsibility with active engagement in democratic revitalization? What strategies did you find?
Well, I think engagement in democratic revitalization is a corporate responsibility. So for me, there's no kind of contradiction. I think that I think it's obvious, and it's interesting for us because we've gotten, in the last year or two, we're flooded by business people who want to talk about this, because it's become blatantly obvious, I think, if you're in business, that you can't operate in a vacuum outside of kind of political impact. And we talked yesterday actually about double materiality that we talk about in sustainability, that this is also relevant here, that on a lot of levels, how you act as a business has impact on democracy, but also how society develops from an institutional stability and democratic dimension has deep impact on your abilities to build a successful business. So I don't think this is, it's like saying, how do you balance between kind of climate action or strategy? And you know, this is one of the things that I think as a business person we need to think about.
So you basically think it's part of it?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But then, to be clear, I think this is an area where kind of people's thinking is less mature. So what we're now, I talked about that we're planning to set something up in a sort of membership organization, and the purpose of that would be three things. One is to more clearly kind of make and articulate and promote the business case for democracy. There's a lot of research that shows that there is a business case for democracy and that it's important for business. The second part is developing the toolbox of how business can engage. There was a panel here about hate speech, etc. There's the Business Council for Democracy in Germany, which is a community of like 200 quite large Lidl, Siemens, German companies that gotten together to engage in democracy. And one of the most successful things they do is they provide courses for private sector employees to train them on hate speech and on kind of the online environment and how to deal with online threats, etc. But then the third thing, again, is kind of the community and the safety in numbers. That by doing this and kind of forming kind of a trade union of businesses for democracy, I think that kind of diffuses some of the risks for business.
Okay. We have people here from the business, we have people from the civic society, NGOs, academic background, even from some public services. How important is the networking among those people, and how to create it? You have background from business, you have background from the philanthropy, so you can understand different sides. So how to make this work?
So I think one of the realizations that have been important for us, I think, in focusing on this work, is the observation that kind of the revitalization of politics and politics becoming trusted and transformational is in a way the meta issue of our time. I think that if we fail to do that, it doesn't matter how strong the private sector is or civil society is in the long term, if we don't have trusted and transparent and democratic transformational public institutions. So I think that's kind of the first thing I would say, that collaboration between the different sectors in society is absolutely crucial. Politics is needed, but also politics is not going to be able to fix the big challenges that we have without the input of civil society and business. And I think one of the things that we talk a lot about and that we kind of try and calibrate is, and we talk about it as our, in a way, most valuable currency, is that I think we've successfully been able to position ourselves between institutions and civil society and activism and social movements, most people are kind of squarely on one side. You're on the institutional side and you have absolutely no legitimacy or trust with the social movements, or vice versa. And I think that bridging is absolutely crucial, because the renewal of our institutions exists in those social movements and in the individuals that are engaged in societal change and have kind of a lot of political potential. But we have to kind of bridge them in to the rooms and the tables where the decisions are made.
Okay, so the bridges are extremely important.
Yes.
Okay.
Or the tunnels.
Or the tunnels.
Yes.
Whatever it is, it has to connect those.
Yep.
Okay.
You can choose.
Okay, it can be a road.
Yep.
So probably last two questions. One is there connected with immigration into Sweden and how to get those young people, immigrants, engage into politics. If you have any special things, at the very beginning you mentioned that this inclusive part of your mentality. So have you changed in doing things just because the immigration in Sweden, or?
We haven't changed, but the demand for what we do has changed in a way.
Okay.
But it's interesting because, of course, we noted sometimes that our kind of the demographic of our programs is in a way the opposite of the institutional demographic. It's younger, it's more diverse. We have a majority of women in our programs. We have a much larger proportion of people with migrant backgrounds in our programs, because, of course, the people who do not have access through kind of the traditional party structures, etc., and are interested in political change, they come to us. And I think that's an important role to play, but it's not that we select them on that basis. We only select on political potential. But as you can imagine, some of the people who come from backgrounds and with experiences where their voice hasn't been heard, those are some of the most powerful drivers of change and some of the most powerful change makers, and that have kind of a fire within them to change society. And so what we're trying to do is capture that and give them a channel into politics.
Okay, and probably the last question will be about Slovakia. We are in a difficult situation, polarization of the society. You can see the politics. It's difficult. The trust has collapsed, basically. So where do we start? From your
So I'm very humble in terms of I don't know anything about Slovakia, but I think the observation I would make is that there's been a lot of talk on this stage already about polarization, and I think it's important that we understand what we mean when we talk about polarization, because, and I'll give you a Polish example. So abortion again, sorry for talking about abortion a lot, but it is kind of a polarizing issue, let's say. So in the Polish election, abortion was a really important kind of messaging and kind of a whistleblower on both sides, etc. And then more in common that we work with, who are a really interesting organization that look at kind of the common base and the broad tent of ideology and values, they did some very serious polling in Poland. That's polling in Poland. But on the attitudes to abortion, and it turns out that over 80% of polls are pro-abortion with different nuances. So people aren't polarized. Politics is polarized on these issues. And I think there's social polarization. There's also all kinds of kind of inequality, and that drives polarization, etc. But it's not an ideological polarization. I think if you go and poll in European societies, there's still a broad tent of 80–85% that broadly agree on the kind of values that our societies are built on. There are two main kind of forces in society that drive polarization. Party politics is one of them. And the other is media, and especially social media, because they make money from polarization, frankly. So I think it's really important that we don't just kind of randomly talk about how polarized society is, because I think there's a lot of common ground. And you come back to the issue of trust, because I think if you have institutional and kind of vertical trust, you can build that horizontal trust over time. I'll give you one last more example.
Yeah, please.
A friend of ours that we supported, Nika Kovac, who's not in Slovakia but in Slovenia, she twice ran a referendum on gay marriage. The first time, she was kind of the activist outside, and she was promoting it in a very aggressive way, I think, in terms of based on her own values, and she got like 20% of the vote. Then she had a second chance, I think 10 years later, and then they reframed it, and they reframed it in terms of freedom. in terms of individual freedom, and that referendum was a great success. So I think it's also sometimes about how do we frame, I mean, again, if you come back to the broad tent of things we agree on, but we also have to talk about them in kind of ways that build community and cohesion, and that don't create kind of friction. So I think kind of crowding people into these discussions and trying to protect those values that are important to us in ways that are open to disagreement and people's different perspectives and views.
Daniel, thank you. Thank you for your time, for sharing your thoughts. Daniel Sachs.
Thank you very much.
Daniel Sachs Foundation. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.